The groan of the wagon wheels was the only sound that had followed Jack Callahan for the last 100 miles, a mournful companion across the scorched expanse of the Arizona Territory. Now, it fell silent. He pulled the weary mule to a halt, the dust settling around him in a slow, suffocating cloud. Before him stood his inheritance. The lawyer's letter had called it a ranch. Looking at the skeletal structure ahead, Jack thought graveyard was more fitting. The house sagged in the middle, its porch grinning a broken-toothed smile where planks had rotted away. Windows stared out like vacant eyes, shattered and dark. The sun, a merciless hammer in the vast, bleached blue sky, beat down on the warped timber and cracked adobe, baking the failure into its very bones. His companion, a scruffy mutt named Buster with one floppy ear and an oversized sense of duty, hopped down from the wagon, his paws sinking into the fine, reddish dust. He let out a low whine, sniffing the air as if tasting the decay. "Well, boy, this is it," Jack said, his voice raspy from disuse and thirst. "Home, sweet home." The words tasted like ash. After 4 years of cannon fire and the screams of men in fields from Shiloh to Appomattox, he'd craved silence. But this was a different kind, a hollow, dead quiet that felt heavier than any noise. He swung his leg over the side of the wagon, his knee protesting with a familiar, dull ache, a permanent souvenir from a piece of shrapnel. Every step towards the house was a negotiation with his own body and the crushing disappointment in his chest. He pushed open the front door, which hung precariously on a single leather hinge. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of dry rot, dust, and long-gone memories. Sunlight streamed through holes in the roof, illuminating swirling motes of dust like frantic ghosts. A rusted wood stove sat in one corner, and a single, rickety chair lay on its side, as if kicked over in a final, desperate act. He ran a hand over a dusty mantelpiece, his fingers leaving clean streaks. There was nothing here. No history he could claim, just the empty shell of a life lived and lost by a great uncle he'd never even met. Stepping back outside, blinking in the harsh light, his gaze fell on something above the doorway. A horseshoe nailed fast to the lintel. It wasn't new or hopeful. It was ancient, rusted deep, and worn unnaturally smooth in places, as if countless hands had touched it, not for luck, but for protection. It seemed less a charm and more a ward, a desperate attempt to keep something out. Or perhaps to keep something in. As the sun began its slow descent, painting the desolate landscape in brutal shades of orange and purple, Jack felt the true weight of his isolation. He wasn't building a future here. He was standing on the ruins of a past he didn't understand. He sat on the edge of the wagon bed, his rifle resting across his lap, a habit the war had burned into him. Buster came and sat at his feet, pressing against his leg, a warm, living anchor in the vast emptiness. The desert air grew cold quickly. The silence deepened, and under a blanket of impossibly bright stars, Jack watched over his broken kingdom, completely unaware of the secrets the hard, unforgiving ground beneath his feet was waiting to give up. The dawn in Arizona didn't so much arrive as it did attack. A sliver of blinding white light appeared over the distant mesas, instantly turning the cool, dark desert into a furnace. Jack was jolted awake not by the light, but by the oppressive heat that already felt like a physical weight inside the small, stuffy room. Buster was panting beside him, his tail giving a few half-hearted thumps against the floorboards. The first order of business was painfully clear: water. Without it, they wouldn't last a week. He grabbed his canteen, a battered Union Army relic, and stepped outside. The landscape was a harsh tapestry of reds and browns, dotted with the skeletal arms of saguaro cacti and the dusty green of creosote bushes. According to the deed's crude map, the well was about 100 yards behind the barn. He found it easily enough, a circular stone structure, wide enough to swallow a man, its mouth covered by rotting planks. A wave of dread washed over him. If the well was dry, this entire endeavor was over before it began. He pried the planks away, the wood crumbling into splinters in his hands. A gust of cool, musty air rose from the darkness below. Hope flickered in his chest. The rope was frayed and the wooden bucket was cracked, but he carefully lowered it, feeling the line go slack far sooner than he'd expected. When he hauled it back up, his shoulders straining, it was barely a quarter full with brackish, silt-filled water. It wasn't much, but it was a start. It was life. He spent the next hour painstakingly drawing bucket after bucket, letting the sediment settle in a rusty barrel he'd found near the barn. With a temporary water supply secured, Jack decided to walk the property line to understand the scope of his inheritance. Buster trotted ahead, occasionally darting after lizards that skittered across the baked earth. The land was bigger than Jack had anticipated, bordered on one side by a dry, rocky wash and on the other by a series of low, unforgiving hills. It was as he was circling back near a jagged outcropping of red rock that Buster's behavior changed. The dog stopped dead, his body tensed. A low growl rumbled in his chest, his nose pressed firmly to a patch of ground that looked no different from any other. "What is it, boy?" Jack asked, scanning the area for snakes. But Buster ignored him, his focus absolute. He began to whine, pawing at the hard-packed dirt, his claws scraping uselessly against the sun-hardened crust. Jack tried to call him off, but the dog was fixated, his agitation growing. It was unnerving. Just as he managed to pull Buster away by the scruff of his neck, a voice echoed across the desolate landscape, startling them both. "You'd be wise to leave that ground alone." Jack spun around, his hand instinctively moving toward the pistol tucked in his belt. On a distant ridge, a stooped figure stood beside a mule laden with supplies. He was too far to make out details, but the man's silhouette was that of an old prospector. The man shouted again, his voice raspy and carried by the wind. "That's cursed ground you're on, son. The Red Creek Ranch, it don't give, it only takes." Before Jack could yell back, the old man turned, tugging his mule along, and disappeared over the ridge, leaving only silence and the buzzing of insects. The cryptic warning hung in the air, thick and unsettling. Jack looked down at the patch of earth, then at Buster, who was still trembling slightly. The desert sun beat down on his shoulders, but for the first time, Jack felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. The prospector's words, "cursed ground," clung to Jack's thoughts like the fine desert dust that settled on everything. He tried to brush them away, reasoning they were nothing more than the sun-addled ramblings of a lonely old man. Superstition was a luxury for those who weren't fighting for survival. He had a roof to patch, fences to mend, and a life to build from the splinters of his past. There was no time for local ghost stories. He spent the afternoon attempting to impose order on the chaos. He dragged the rotted remains of a trough away from the barn, the dry wood crumbling in his hands. He tried to clear a space for a small vegetable garden, his shovel turning over nothing but rock-hard soil and stubborn roots. Every task felt monumental, a battle against years of neglect. But the real battle was with the growing unease in his own mind, an unease fed by Buster's relentless behavior. The dog was no longer just interested in the spot near the dilapidated fence line, he was consumed by it. He ignored Jack's calls, showing no interest in the piece of dried meat Jack offered him. He simply lay there, panting in the oppressive heat, his eyes fixed on the patch of dirt. Occasionally, he would rise and dig frantically for a few moments, his paws sending clouds of dust into the air, before collapsing again with a low, mournful whine that grated on Jack's nerves. As the sun began its descent, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and purple, the atmosphere on the ranch shifted. The heat lessened, but a different kind of weight settled in. The vast, open silence of the day transformed into a watchful, enclosing darkness. Every rustle of the wind through the sagebrush sounded like a whisper. Every distant coyote howl felt like a warning. Jack retreated inside the small cabin, lighting a lantern that cast long, dancing shadows across the bare wooden walls. He tried to bring Buster inside, but the dog refused, scratching at the door to be let back out, his silhouette barely visible as he immediately returned to his vigil. Jack ate his meager dinner of beans and hardtack in solitude, the silence broken only by the sound of Buster's intermittent whining from outside. He tried to read a worn copy of a newspaper he'd brought with him, but the words blurred together. He couldn't focus. The dog's distress was a constant, unnerving presence just beyond the thin wooden door. He eventually gave up and blew out the lantern, lying down on his bedroll. Sleep, however, was a distant country. The sound from outside intensified. The whining grew more desperate, punctuated by the rhythmic scrape of claws against the hard-packed earth. It wasn't the sound of a dog digging for a prairie dog. It was the sound of a creature in deep distress, an obsessive, maddening sound that echoed the prospector's ominous cry. Cursed ground. Takes, never gives. Hours crawled by. Midnight came and went. Jack's patience, worn thin by war, exhaustion, and loneliness, finally snapped. The sound wasn't just noise anymore, it was an accusation. He shot up from his bedroll, his heart hammering against his ribs with a sudden, violent surge of frustration and a dark, morbid curiosity. He couldn't take another second of it. He lit the lantern again, its yellow light flaring to life, and strode to the door. He grabbed the rusted shovel he'd found leaning against the barn earlier in the day. Its iron head was heavy, its wooden handle splintered but solid. With a grim set to his jaw, he pushed the door open and stepped out into the cool, dark air. Buster stopped his digging and looked up, his tail giving a single, hopeful thump against the ground. Jack marched directly to the spot, the lantern casting a pool of wavering light on the disturbed earth. He was going to put an end to this, one way or another. He planted his feet, raised the shovel, and with a grunt born of anger and dread, plunged it into the ground. The shovel blade struck the ground with a dull, defiant thud. The moon, a cold silver disk in the vast, star-dusted sky, offered the only light, casting long, distorted shadows that danced at the edge of Jack's vision. Buster whined again, a low, urgent sound that grated on Jack's already frayed nerves. He ignored the dog, planting his worn boot on the shovel's shoulder and throwing his full weight into the task. The earth refused to yield, hard as brick, baked by a decade of relentless Arizona sun. Sweat beaded on his forehead, stinging his eyes as it trickled down his temples. Each strike sent a jarring shock up his arms. This wasn't farming soil. It was a crust of baked clay and rock, a tombstone for whatever lay beneath. He grunted with effort, the rhythmic sound of his breathing and the percussive clang of metal on earth replacing Buster's incessant noise. The dog now paced in tight circles, his claws scrabbling at the dirt as if trying to help, his anxiety a palpable force in the chilling night air. "Almost there, boy," Jack muttered, more to himself than to the dog. "Almost done with this foolishness." After what felt like an eternity, something changed. The shovel sank an inch deeper with a gritty crunch, breaking through the compacted surface layer. The resistance lessened. Encouraged, Jack worked faster, scooping out loose, dusty soil. He dug down a foot, then another. The hole was still shallow, but it was a start. He paused, leaning on the shovel handle to catch his breath, his back aching. What in God's name was he even looking for? An animal carcass? Some strange root system? He plunged the shovel in again, and this time, it struck something with a muffled scrape that was decidedly not rock. It was a dull, soft impact, followed by the grating of metal against something yielding but solid. Jack froze. He dropped to one knee, the rough fabric of his trousers scraping against the stony ground. He reached into the shallow pit, his calloused fingers brushing away the loose dirt. The moonlight illuminated what he touched. It was dark, cracked, and oddly textured. His mind, conditioned by years of war and hardship, raced through possibilities. Old leather, a piece of a saddle. He brushed more dirt away, his heart beginning to pound a heavy, frantic rhythm against his ribs. The shape became clearer. It was the unmistakable, squared-off toe of a boot. A man's boot, rotting and misshapen with age and subterranean pressure. A cold dread, far more potent than his earlier frustration, washed over him. This wasn't some lost piece of gear. He forced himself to keep clearing the soil, his movements now slow and deliberate. The boot's upper portion came into view, the leather peeling away from a brittle, pale form within. Bones. The slender, skeletal remains of a foot, and ankle rested inside the decaying leather coffin. Jack snatched his hand back as if he'd touched a hot coal, scrambling backward and kicking loose pebbles into the hole. He stared, his breath caught in his throat. The prospector's words echoed in his mind, no longer the ramblings of a sun-crazed old man, but a prophecy fulfilled. Cursed ground. Buster finally fell silent. The dog sat on his haunches, his head cocked, looking from the hole to Jack, his work seemingly done. The sudden absence of his whining was more terrifying than the noise itself. In the ringing silence, the vast, empty desert seemed to press in on Jack, and the crumbling ranch house behind him felt less like a shelter and more like a mausoleum. He was no longer just a homesteader on a piece of forgotten land. He was the keeper of a grave. The shovel fell from Jack's hands, clattering against a stone with a sound that seemed to echo for miles in the dead-still air. He stumbled back, his breath catching in his throat, a cold sweat breaking out across his brow despite the cool desert night. The image of the skeletal foot, caged within the rotting leather, was seared into his mind. This wasn't a curse. It was a grave, a secret one. His first instinct, primal and overwhelming, was to run. To fill the hole, pack his meager belongings, and ride until this godforsaken patch of Arizona was nothing but a bad memory. He had seen enough death in the war to last 100 lifetimes. He hadn't come here to unearth more of it. He had come to bury his own ghosts, not dig up someone else's. Buster, now silent and calm, patted over and nudged Jack's hand with his wet nose, a low whine escaping him. It wasn't the sound of agitation anymore, but of concern. Jack looked from the dog to the hole in the ground. Fleeing felt like a betrayal of the man in the ground, of his own code forged in the army. You didn't leave a man behind, and you didn't turn your back on a crime. The prospector's warning rang in his ears, no longer a superstitious ramble, but a chilling truth. Cursed ground. Cursed by what men do to each other. With a deep, shuddering breath, Jack hardened his jaw. His hands, slick with sweat, gripped the shovel again. He couldn't leave this. He had to know. He moved back to the edge of the shallow pit, the moonlight casting long, distorted shadows that made the hole look like a gaping wound in the earth. He began to dig again, but this time his movements were slow, deliberate, almost reverent. He wasn't just moving dirt, he was performing an exhumation. The shovel soon scraped against something else metallic. Jack knelt, using his bare hands to carefully brush away the soil. His fingers closed around a cold, heavy object. He pulled it free and held it up to the moonlight. It was a silver belt buckle, heavily tarnished with age and dirt. He rubbed the grime away with his thumb, revealing ornate, Western-style engraving. And in the center, 2 initials. TM, the victim suddenly had a name, or at least part of one. TM was no longer just a collection of bones, but a person who had lived, ridden this land, and met a violent end here. Emboldened by the discovery, Jack worked with a grim purpose. He carefully uncovered more of the skeleton. It was sprawled in the grave, its limbs at awkward angles, suggesting the body had been unceremoniously dumped. He found the rib cage, and his breath hitched. Several ribs were shattered, the breaks old and jagged, clear evidence of a brutal, blunt force assault. This was no accident. This was a murder, vicious and personal. He worked until the first pale fingers of dawn stretched across the eastern mountains, painting the sky in shades of gray and rose. The hole had yielded all its secrets for now: a partial skeleton, a boot, and a belt buckle. Jack sat back on his heels, exhausted, his body aching, his mind numb. The rising sun illuminated the scene with a harsh, unforgiving light. The peaceful sanctuary he had envisioned was gone, replaced by a crime scene. He looked at the initials on the buckle one last time. He didn't know who TM was, but he knew he couldn't rebury this secret. Justice, however old the debt, had to be paid. The first rays of dawn spilled over the jagged peaks, painting the arid landscape in hues of soft pink and orange, a cruel mockery of the grim scene by the crumbling well. Jack stood over the shallow grave, the desert chill seeping into his bones, a feeling far colder than the morning air. The initial shock had receded, replaced by the grim, methodical calm he'd learned to summon on the battlefield. This was no longer just a piece of inherited land. It was a crime scene, and the dead deserved more than a forgotten burial. He carefully covered the remains with the tattered canvas he'd brought for his supplies, weighing it down with rocks. It was a poor measure of respect, but it was all he could offer. The tarnished silver buckle felt heavy in his palm, a cold, solid piece of evidence. He wrapped it in a spare piece of cloth and tucked it securely into his saddlebag. There was no question of what came next. He had to ride to Prescott. Leaving Buster with a full bowl of water and the last of his dried meat, Jack saddled his horse, the creak of the leather echoing in the profound silence. "You stay here, boy. Keep watch," he murmured, resting a hand on the dog's head. Buster whined softly, his brown eyes filled with an unsettling understanding. The journey to Prescott was an ordeal of dust and sun. The trail snaked through sun-baked mesas and rocky canyons, the heat shimmering off the ground in waves. With every plodding step of his horse, Jack's mind churned. He had come west seeking a quiet end to a life defined by violence, hoping to bury the ghosts of the war. Instead, he had dug one up. Who was TM? A prospector, a traveler, a rancher? How long had he been lying there, his story untold? The initials on the buckle were the man's last testament, and now that testament was in Jack's possession. The responsibility felt heavier than his rifle ever had. He reached Prescott as the afternoon sun began its descent, casting long shadows across the bustling Main Street. The town was a cacophony of life. The ring of a blacksmith's hammer, the boisterous laughter from a saloon, the rumble of wagon wheels on the hard-packed dirt. After the profound isolation of the ranch, the noise was jarring. He located the sheriff's office, a modest clapboard building with a faded sign, and dismounted. Taking a deep breath, he pushed the door open. The man behind the desk looked up, his eyes weary beneath the brim of his hat. He was older, with a thick mustache and a face etched with the lines of 100 hard decisions. A tin star was pinned to his vest. "Help you with something?" he asked, his voice a low, gravelly drawl. "My name is Jack Callahan. I need to report a murder," Jack stated, his voice flat and steady. The sheriff, whose nameplate read Miller, leaned back in his chair, unimpressed. "That's so, who got murdered?" "I don't know his name. I found his body on my property, the old Henderson place north of here." Miller's eyes narrowed with skepticism. "The Henderson place? Been abandoned for 20 years. You telling me you just stumbled across a fresh body out there?" "Not fresh," Jack corrected, reaching into his bag. "He's been in the ground a long time." He unwrapped the cloth and placed the silver buckle on the desk. The initials TM were dull but legible. "I found this with him." Sheriff Miller picked up the buckle, his demeanor shifting from weary dismissal to sharp-eyed interest. He turned it over in his calloused fingers, the weight of it seeming to convince him more than Jack's words. He looked up at Jack, a new, calculating expression on his face. "You dug him up?" "My dog found the spot. I had to know what was there." Miller set the buckle down with a decisive click. "All right, Mr. Callahan, I'll ride out with you at first light tomorrow. But I'm warning you," he said, his gaze locking with Jack's. "This better not be some wild goose chase. Stirring up old dust in this county can cause a lot of trouble." The air was thick with unspoken questions as Jack and Sheriff Miller stood before the shallow grave. The morning sun baked the dry earth, but a chill clung to the site. Miller knelt, his earlier skepticism completely gone, replaced by the focused gravity of a seasoned lawman. He examined the remains with a professional eye, his movements slow and deliberate. Buster sat quietly by Jack's side, his duty done. "You were right, Callahan," Miller said, his voice low. "This wasn't a squabble. See the fracture here on the parietal bone? He was struck from behind, and these ribs shattered. This was an ambush, an execution." Miller carefully sifted through the dirt around the skeleton, his gaze missing nothing. While Jack had focused on the bones, the sheriff scanned the periphery. His eyes landed on the base of a rotted fence post a few feet from the grave. He noticed the ground there was slightly raised, almost unnaturally. He walked over, pulled out a pocket knife, and began to carefully pry at the hardened soil. After a moment, the blade hit something soft. Miller dug with his fingers, pulling a small, oilskin pouch from the earth. The leather was brittle with age, but the drawstring was still intact. He untied it and poured the contents into his palm, 3 rough, gleaming gold nuggets. He stood up, holding the nuggets in one hand and the tarnished TM buckle in the other. A distant memory flickered in his eyes, connecting decades of dust-covered town lore. Thomas Mercer, he breathed out, the name hanging in the still air. He was a prospector, partnered with a man named Elias Thorne. They were working a claim up in the Bradshaw Mountains. Jack felt a jolt run through him. Thorne, Elias Thorne is the name on the deed. He sold this ranch to my great-uncle. Miller nodded slowly, the entire bloody history unfolding in his mind. The story was that Mercer struck a rich vein and ran off with it all, leaving Thorne with nothing. Thorne sold this land for a pittance not long after and moved his family to California, claiming he couldn't stand the memory of his partner's betrayal. He looked from the gold in his hand to the skeleton in the grave. But this tells the real story. Thorne killed his partner for his share, buried him here, and hid the evidence. He faked a betrayal to cover a murder. Justice, it turned out, wasn't a chase, but an unearthing. The killer was long dead, beyond the reach of any law, but the truth was finally free. Later that day, after Miller had arranged for Mercer's remains to be respectfully transported back to Prescott for a proper burial, he shook Jack's hand. "You brought a lost man home, Callahan. It seems you didn't just inherit a piece of land, you inherited a duty. You did right by it." As the sheriff's wagon disappeared down the dusty track, Jack stood alone with Buster, the silence of the ranch feeling different. It was no longer the silence of abandonment, but of peace. The horseshoe above the door no longer seemed ominous. It was just a relic of a guilty man's past. He looked at the crumbling adobe house, not as a symbol of decay, but as a foundation waiting to be rebuilt. He had come here seeking solitude to escape the ghosts of war, and instead, by giving a voice to a forgotten soul, he had finally quieted his own. The Arizona sun warmed his face, and for the first time, Jack Callahan felt like he was home.